Okay, pilots, welcome back to the final topic of this 0G series. This is going to be topic 5, orbiting. Okay, so why is it important to orbit? Well, let's look at the track graphic for the expert variant of Beautiful Glen. And in this track, there are two portions where orbiting will help you tremendously, and that's turn it up, where you're basically going around the arm of the station, and at roundabout, where you're going around the center of the station. Okay, so I'll just zoom that in for you. Turn it up, roundabout, very important to know how to orbit around the arm in the center. So where your crosshair is pointed matters when you're orbiting. So let me demonstrate that in game. Let's practice orbiting around the center of the station. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my mains to push my ship forward. Right now I'm only using my mains at full power with no boost. And notice where my crosshair is right now. I'm doing my best to keep it at the center of the station. And when you keep your crosshair at the center, you're going to be orbiting at a relatively same distance. You're gonna maintain that distance of whatever object you're orbiting around. Okay. So if you want to maintain the distance of whatever you're orbiting, you want to have your crosshair right down the middle. So how do you tighten up the orbit? How do you make your loops smaller? Well, right now I'm orbiting clockwise. So if you want to tighten up the orbit or tighten up the loop, make the loop smaller, you basically want to point your crosshair on the inside, in this case the right edge of the station. So I'm going to do that right now, and you'll see that I'm getting much closer to the center of the station. That's how you tighten up your orbit. Okay, and then once you're close enough, you can put your crosshair back to the center. And same goes the opposite way. If I want to make the loop larger, make my orbit larger, you want to point your crosshair on the outside, in this case the left edge of the station. You can see I'm farther away from it now, and that's how you make your orbit larger. Okay, so where your crosshair is pointed matters. The orientation of your ship matters. Okay. Another thing you could do while you're orbiting is you can, again, combine your turns. So if, in this case, I'm going to implement my verts as well, which means you'll have to roll your ship a little more, and you can see that I'm orbiting quicker. But since I'm using my verts, I'm inducing positive G's, which means that I could G-lock if I'm not careful, so be very careful. And of course you can boost as well if you want to orbit around whatever you're orbiting around quicker, but again, be careful with G-lock. Okay, so that's how you orbit. And you may wonder what matters more, the thruster power or the orientation of your ship. And I would argue that the orientation of your ship and where your nose is pointed matters more than the power of your thrusters or your boost when it comes to orbiting. Okay. One more thing about orbiting. So I just showed you how to orbit when you're already in the orbit, but what about how to enter the orbit? And to be honest, the hardest thing about orbiting isn't the orbit itself, but it's entering the orbit. It's as you approach whatever you're approaching and then entering it. Okay, and then once you're in the orbit, then it's a lot easier. So how do you enter an orbit? Well, I'll demonstrate again, kind of like what I just did. Usually you're going to be orbiting it at very high speeds. And what you want to do is you want to use your mains and do kind of like a turn and burn maneuver and use your boost to slow yourself down and then enter into an orbit. So let me draw what's happening right now, and then I'll explain in a little more detail. So let's say I want to orbit around roundabout, okay? And I will draw my flight path in green. So what you want to do is you want to do something that would look like this, okay? You enter the orbit and you want to keep the loop really tight. But how do you do that? Well, if generally what would usually happen is you're entering the center of the station, but then the parabola is you're gonna basically maintain the parabola, but this is a very large basically a large orbit, and you want to tighten it up a lot. So this goes back to the orientation of your ship and where your crosshair is pointed. If I was entering the center of the station, and if I just kept my if I kept my crosshair at the center, it would keep the loop really large. Okay, so let me demonstrate that again. So I'm entering the orbit. But right now the loop is really large, and you can see I'm using a lot of boost to try to really stay in there. But I'm also having my crosshair. Right now, my crosshair is pointed at the center of the station. So what I'm getting at is when you're entering an orbit, you do not want your crosshair pointed at the center of the thing that you're about to enter. Okay? When you're entering an orbit, you want to tighten the loop. So you don't want to have your crosshair at the center, but rather way on the inside to tighten up the loop. Okay? Just like that. So you're essentially you're kind of like doing a turn and burn maneuver as you're entering the orbit. So using my mains, I'm keeping that crosshair far on the inside, and then once you're in, then you can keep your crosshair at the center. Okay. So let me demonstrate what that would look like at turn it up, which is the other arm that you have to orbit. Okay, so this is the start finish of expert variant, which is different from the novice. I'm gonna go around the first turn here, and now I'm about to enter my first orbit here around the arm. Okay, so you're essentially doing a turn and burn maneuver. You're keeping the crosshair far on the inside, and then when you're in the orbit, then your crosshair could be at the center of the arm. Okay, so again, the entry or the entrance of the orbit is the hardest part of the orbit, but once you're in the orbit, it's pretty easy. So be very careful when you enter an orbit. Definitely want to practice this on your own.